I have the greatest job in the world. I'm the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, the world's largest environmental organization, work on every continent, 40 countries, and I get to travel to all these places as a scientist to see if what we're doing on the ground is making a difference, and if it isn't, trying to figure out how to do things differently. And one of the books that had a huge impact on me and shapes how I approach these problems is Michael and Ted's book, The Death of Environmentalism. And in that book, they lay out very, very clearly that environmentalists have made two big mistakes. The first mistake is to be all about doom and gloom. And their famous quote was that if Martin Luther King had been an environmentalist, he would have given a "I have a nightmare" speech instead of a "I have a dream" speech. And their other big point is, look, we can't do conservation on an environment if we don't first take care of people, because people have basic needs. They need food and security before they're going to worry about biodiversity and other aspects of nature. And those resonated with me. And I knew from my practical experience working in China, in Mongolia, in Ecuador, in Colombia, that unless we worked with people to take care of their basic needs, there was not a hope of getting any traction in conservation. So in Ecuador, how do we get the Paramal and the upriver forest protected? We get them protected only because they deliver water to Quito, the capital city of Ecuador, and the population there and the businesses there and even breweries there pay for conservation because it links to their own needs. And this is the message for conservation going forward. It cannot just be an affluent, white, upper middle class American imposition of its values on the world. You know, I grew up, I frankly admit, I got into conservation because as a kid in high school, I took hikes. I got to see wolves, I got to see moose, and it inspired me, and it was wonderful. But that's not the way most of the world is going to be brought to conservation. Most of the world is going to be brought to the environment because by protecting the environment, they make their own lives better. And that's what I try to do in my work. As I said, we do not always succeed, but by not being so ideological and really just caring about what works and what doesn't work, not what people's values are, I think we have a great chance. There's this notion out there, and a lot of us have read these books and read these philosophies of this pristine wilderness that exists out there in which we can venture. It's almost always a solitary man. Solitary man can venture and rediscover himself and find himself and be inspired and somehow learn something more about the universe and themselves. Henry David Thoreau was a classic take on that. And in the 60s, when I grew up, I read Edward Abbey. Edward Abbey wrote a book called Desert Solitary. Fascinating book. I loved it. I recently discovered his personal journals. In Desert Solitary, Edward Abbey has a couple lines in there in one of the opening chapters about sitting out there in Utah and being by himself and looking up at the stars and writing poetically about, oh, I'm alone, there's nobody else around, it is beautiful, I feel nothing but exhilaration and happiness. The same time, in his personal diary, he wrote, oh my God, I'm so lonely, why did my wife Rita have to go back to New Jersey? It's a lie. It's a total lie. He didn't even mention in the book that the second year he had been so lonely the first year that his whole family was with him. Yet he paints this picture of man alone in a wilderness with no other man. They were testing hydrogen bombs. They were testing atomic bombs in Nevada, which he could see. He blacks that out of the book. And in a sense, the environmental movement has blacked out the fact that our footprint is everywhere. You go to the Arctic and you sample fatty tissue of a polar bear, of a salmon, and anything, and you'll find pesticides in that fatty tissue. So there is no wilderness that we haven't touched. Our footprint may not have trampled, all of the world, but it has certainly touched all of the world. And if we admit that, then we can have a more realistic view about what the environment should be. There's another sort of fatal flaw in the environmental movement, I would call it, a myth that really doesn't hold up, and that is this notion of delicate Mother Nature, fragile nature, and you go to any website, of any of the environmental groups, including my environmental group, Nature Conservancy. And if you look up things, you'll see things like the fragile river, the fragile desert. You could find books and you'll see children holding the globe in their hands, and it'll talk about the fragile world. Well, my experience, on-the-ground experience, going to places that have been devastated, and hardcore scientific data says quite the contrary. You want to find the most thriving populations of endangered mammals and birds in Russia, you go to Chernobyl. In the Bikini Atoll, the U.S. did its last big hydrogen bomb test. It vaporized islands. It boiled the ocean. Go back there now, and there's more coral than there was ever there. There's tremendous, capacity to restore and recover nature, and it doesn't break that easily. Now, that's not to say that we can't do damage, but just think of the different way of you. In one view of the world, you assume nature's fragile, and that means no negotiation. I will not negotiate with you, mining company. I will not negotiate with you, energy company. There can be no oil drilling because nature's fragile. The other view of the world is nature's resilient. There are some things you can do that will damage it and maybe break it, but we got room to negotiate. We can find a way for your needs to be met and us to meet the needs of nature.